I remember the weight of my suitcase in my hand, the slight ache in my shoulder from carrying it through 3 airports and 2 taxis. The business trip had been successful. Presentations delivered, contracts signed, my reputation as a careful, meticulous CPA further cemented. I had allowed myself a small flutter of pride on the flight home, thinking of the house that awaited me. My house. My sanctuary. The physical manifestation of every careful decision I had made since I was 25. I remember standing at my own front door, key poised at the lock, when something made me pause. A shadow passing behind the curtains, perhaps. The faintest echo of unfamiliar movement inside what should have been empty rooms. The air felt different somehow, disturbed, rearranged, as if someone had been breathing inside my private space while I was away. The toys were the first thing I noticed. Primary colors scattered across my muted living room floor, like jarring punctuation marks in the middle of a quiet sentence. Then the half-assembled crib, its instructions splayed open on my guest room carpet. Cardboard boxes stacked in uneven towers along my hallway, each one bearing my brother's name in thick black marker. I remember how my suitcase slipped from my fingers, the hollow thud as it hit the hardwood floors I had refinished myself 3 summers ago. The house felt violated, rearranged, as if someone had reached inside my chest and shifted my organs while I slept. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a voicemail notification. My mother's voice filled the space, casual and light, as if she were simply informing me of a change in dinner plans. "Hope you don't mind, honey. It just makes sense for them to be with family. You have the space, after all." No discussion. No permission. Just expectation. I stood frozen, listening to the message replay in my mind long after it had ended. The implicit truth behind her words unfolding like a map I suddenly knew how to read. My space was not mine at all. It was a resource to be claimed, repurposed, redistributed according to a hierarchy I had never agreed to. The presumption of it stunned me into a silence, so complete I could hear the dust settling on the unfamiliar objects now occupying my home. I built this house from nothing but numbers and time. Every mortgage payment represented hours spent over spreadsheets, tax forms, financial forecasts for clients who sometimes remembered to thank me. I still remember signing the papers alone, the weight of the pen in my hand, the rushing in my ears as I committed to 30 years of payments. No one stood beside me then. No parent co-signed or offered encouragement. It was understood that my path was mine to forge alone, and I accepted this without bitterness. The first winter, when the heating system failed, I learned to replace parts myself, fingers numb with cold, YouTube tutorials playing on my phone propped against a toolbox. When the bathroom pipe burst the following spring, I took 3 days off work to tear out drywall and learn basic plumbing. Not once did I ask for help, not because of pride, but because I understood the unspoken contract. My independence meant self-reliance. I remember the satisfaction of each repair, each improvement, not just in the house itself, but in my own capacity to solve problems, to face challenges without flinching, to stand firmly on ground I had earned through persistence rather than inheritance or luck. There were no vacations those first 5 years. No new clothes beyond what was necessary for client meetings. No restaurants unless they were business expenses. Just careful, diligent growth. A home taking shape around me, room by room, as I could afford to furnish them. I remember the first real couch I bought, how I sat on it for hours that first evening, running my hands over the fabric, marveling at this solid thing that belonged wholly to me. Meanwhile, I watched from a distance as my brother Eric drifted between enthusiasms and disappointments. Construction jobs abandoned midway. Community college courses dropped before completion. Small business ventures that bloomed briefly before withering under the weight of mismanagement. Each time, our parents' forgiveness was immediate and total. Each time, loans were extended that we all knew would never be repaid. I never judged this. Families are complex systems, and love expresses itself in ways that defy logical accounting. But I also never expected that the sacrifices I had made, the careful life I had built, would someday be treated as a communal asset to be redistributed without my consent. I never imagined that the very independence they had insisted upon would later be used against me, reframed as selfishness when it no longer served their purposes. I remember the stillness that fell over me as I stood in my invaded home. How the anger I expected to feel dissolved into something colder, more clarifying. With careful, deliberate movements, I began to gather the scattered toys. I dismantled the half-built crib and returned each piece to its box. I stacked my brother's possessions by the front door. I worked methodically, without haste but without hesitation, aware with each passing moment that I was reclaiming something more significant than physical space. Then I changed the locks. All of them. Front, back, side entrance to the garden. I remember the locksmith's curious glance, quickly averted when he caught my expression. "Family trouble?" he asked, then immediately waved away his own question. "Never mind. Not my business." I tipped him extra for his discretion, for understanding without being told that some boundaries need reinforcement beyond mere words. By evening, my home was mine again. Empty. Quiet. Inviolate. I turned off my phone and slept dreamlessly for 12 hours. When I woke, I knew with perfect clarity what had to be done. Not in anger, not in revenge, but in necessary preservation of the boundaries that define a life worth living. The messages began immediately, concern shifting rapidly to confusion, then indignation, then a righteous anger that assumed its own legitimacy. My mother's voicemails grew increasingly tearful. "Family sticks together, Claire. That's what we've always done." My father's texts were shorter, more direct. "Call your mother. She's upset." My brother didn't contact me directly at first, a telling silence that spoke volumes about who had initiated this plan. Instead, his wife Jessica began posting oblique references to cold-hearted relatives and the importance of supporting family during difficult times. I watched these digital performances from a distance, neither engaging nor defending myself. There is a certain freedom in stepping away from a system that has always required your compliance but never your consent. I recognized in their reactions the familiar pattern that had shaped my childhood, the assumption that my purpose was to accommodate, to adjust, to make room for others' needs at the expense of my own. The script was so deeply ingrained that they couldn't comprehend my deviation from it. Their confusion was almost as painful to witness as their presumption had been to experience. The cracks spread outward, spiderwebbing through the careful facade of family mythology. Mutual friends began to choose sides based on partial information. I noticed the subtle unfriending, the absence of the usual birthday messages, the invitations that stopped arriving. I had expected this cost and factored it into my calculations. What surprised me was how little it hurt. Like removing a garment that had always been slightly too tight, there was relief in the release. I immersed myself in work, in the quiet rhythm of my reclaimed home. I planted a small garden in the backyard, watching with satisfaction as the first green shoots emerged from soil I had enriched with my own hands. I learned the names of birds that visited my feeders, tracked their migrations through seasons, found comfort in their wild indifference to human concerns. Time passed differently now, no longer measured by the expectations and demands of others, but by the natural cadence of my own needs and interests. The night my mother called, crying was inevitable. I had been expecting it, had rehearsed my response, had fortified myself against the particular timbre of her voice, when she knows exactly how to reach the daughter in me who still seeks approval. "They're going to be homeless if you don't help, Claire." A beat of silence, heavy with accusation. "What will people say?" I closed my eyes, phone pressed against my ear, and for a moment, just a moment, I felt myself bending toward that familiar gravity. The pull of being the responsible. Seasons changed. Leaves fell from the maple tree in my front yard, gathered in drifts against the fence, decomposed into the soil. Snow followed, then the hesitant green of early spring. I tracked these transitions with a new attentiveness, noticing how the light changed in each room of my house throughout the year, how the wood floors contracted slightly in winter's dry air, how the garden responded to different patterns of rainfall. I developed new routines, new friendships with colleagues who appreciated my precision, my reliability. I joined a book club that met on Thursday evenings, surprised by how easily conversation flowed with these women who knew nothing of my family history and therefore couldn't use it as a lens through which to view me. Our discussions of fictional characters' choices often led me to reflect on my own, how circumstances shape us, yes, but how we retain the power to respond to those circumstances in ways that either diminish or enlarge us. I dated occasionally, without urgency, learning to recognize the difference between genuine connection and the mere relief of not being alone. I found myself drawn to people with clear boundaries of their own, people who understood the value of independence without requiring isolation. Life continued, neither better nor worse than before, just more authentically mine. I began to understand that this authenticity was itself a form of wealth, one that couldn't be measured in square footage or property values, but in the quiet satisfaction of waking each morning in a space that perfectly reflected your own values and choices. It was Maria who told me the truth, over coffee on a bright October morning almost 8 months after I had changed my locks. Maria, my mother's oldest friend, who had watched me grow up and who had always treated me with a careful kindness that I now recognized as subtle compensation for my parents' favoritism. The cafe hummed with quiet conversation, sunlight catching in the steam rising from our cups. I had chosen this place for its anonymity, far from the neighborhood where I might encounter family connections. "I thought you knew," she said, eyes not quite meeting mine as she stirred her coffee. The spoon made tiny musical notes against the porcelain, a counterpoint to the sudden stillness I felt spreading through my body. "It wasn't supposed to be temporary. Your parents were planning to transfer your house to Eric eventually. They said it made sense because he had a family to provide for and you—" She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, the words visibly sticking in her throat. I watched a hummingbird pause at the feeder outside the window, its wings invisible with speed, its body perfectly suspended in space. "They said you didn't really need it as much, that you'd understand once it was explained properly. They had discussed it for years," she told me. "An inheritance rearrangement that made perfect sense to them. My brother with his children needed a stable home. I, single and successful, could always buy another. The math was simple in their minds." I remember how still I became, how the sounds of the cafe seemed to recede as the pieces rearranged themselves into a pattern that suddenly made perfect sense. The hummingbird vanished. My coffee grew cold, untouched. It had never been about helping Eric temporarily. It had never been about family sticking together through hard times. It had been about erasing my ownership, about redistributing what I had built to serve someone else's comfort and convenience, about rendering my sacrifices invisible to elevate my brother's needs as inherently more valuable, about the quiet assumptions that had always shaped our family, that my independence was a luxury to be taxed rather than a choice to be respected, that my success made me less deserving of protection rather than more deserving of recognition. I didn't confront them with this knowledge. I didn't need to. The revelation wasn't shocking so much as clarifying, the final piece of a puzzle I'd been assembling unconsciously for years. I paid for Maria's coffee, thanked her with genuine gratitude, and walked home through streets dappled with autumn light. Leaves crunched beneath my feet, red and gold and brown, the colors of necessary endings. The truth sat between us now, my family and me, unacknowledged but unmistakably present, like a piece of furniture too large to ignore, but too awkward to discuss. Occasional messages still arrived on holidays and birthdays, performative gestures of family connection that carefully avoided addressing what had happened. My mother sent cards with generic well wishes. My father called briefly on Christmas, conversation limited to weather and health. My brother remained mostly silent, perhaps understanding better than our parents that some violations cannot be casually repaired. I responded with equal politeness and equal evasion. We were like countries that had survived a border war, now engaging in cautious diplomacy without ever discussing the contested territory. The wall between us was invisible but impenetrable, built of 1,000 small betrayals culminating in one final, unforgivable presumption. I found I could live with this arrangement indefinitely. The anger had burned away long ago, leaving behind not bitterness, but a clear-eyed understanding of what was possible and what was not. Some bridges, once revealed as illusory, cannot be rebuilt with any materials at hand. In their place, I built something different, not connection but perspective. The ability to see my family clearly, to love them for who they were while refusing to be diminished by their limitations. To understand that their actions spoke not of my value but of their perceptions, shaped by patterns established long before I had the language to name them. A year passed, then another. The seasons cycled through my garden, each bringing its own lessons in patience, in timing, in the quiet satisfaction of tending to living things. My house evolved as I did, a new coat of paint in the kitchen, the palest blue, like early morning light, bookshelves extending into spaces once reserved for future children I now knew I might never have. I learned to play the piano, the notes filling rooms that had once echoed with anticipatory silence. I focused on creating beauty where I could control it, cultivating a garden that drew compliments from neighbors and became a small source of local pride. Roses climbing the eastern fence, herbs in terracotta pots, tomatoes that tasted of sunshine and care. I expanded my client base, earned a promotion, started mentoring younger accountants who reminded me of myself a decade earlier, ambitious, meticulous, perhaps a bit too willing to bear burdens without complaint. I found myself gently steering them toward better boundaries than I had maintained at their age, a kind of generational correction that felt like its own form of progress. I traveled occasionally. Weekend trips to coastal towns, a longer journey to Portugal where I wandered ancient streets and spoke to no one who knew my history. I collected experiences instead of obligations, memories that belonged solely to me rather than to a narrative of family expectation. Life acquired a richness I hadn't anticipated in those first raw months of separation, not despite my aloneness, but partially because of it. I discovered textures of solitude I had never noticed before. The productive solitude of early mornings with coffee and spreadsheets, the contemplative solitude of gardening at dusk, the luxurious solitude of reading late into the night with no one to consider but myself. There is power in living without apology, in arranging your days according to your own rhythms rather than in reaction to others' expectations. In making choices based not on how they will be perceived, but on how truly they express your own values and desires. On the third anniversary of what I now think of simply as the incident, I hosted a gathering in my home. Not large, I have never been comfortable with crowds, but significant in its composition. Colleagues who had become friends. Neighbors whose gardens had grown alongside mine. My book club, now a fixture in my life rather than an experiment in sociability. A man I had been seeing for 6 months who understood the value of independence alongside connection. The evening air was mild, windows open to let in the scent of jasmine I had planted specifically for its evening fragrance. Conversation flowed easily, laughter rising and falling like music. I moved through the rooms of my home, refilling glasses and exchanging stories, aware of a sense of rightness that had been years in the making. This gathering wasn't a statement or a replacement for what I had lost. It was simply the natural expression of the life I had built, one connection at a time, one choice at a time, one boundary honored and maintained through consistent action rather than defensive declaration. I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with romance or family in the traditional sense. These were my people, chosen rather than assigned, appreciating me as I was rather than as they needed me to be. The distinction felt profound, worthy of celebration in its own quiet way. In my kitchen, framed simply in black, hangs my mortgage release document. The final payment was made last year, ahead of schedule thanks to careful planning and a fortunate investment. The words, "paid in full," are visible in red across the bottom, a silent monument to a journey made one careful step at a time. I remember the moment I received it in the mail, how I sat at my kitchen table, tracing those words with my fingertip, feeling the slight indentation they made in the paper. The culmination of 15 years of discipline, of choices made and adhered to despite temptation or pressure. Not an inheritance or a gift or a stroke of luck, but the direct result of consistent action aligned with deeply held values. Visitors sometimes notice it, sometimes ask about its prominence in a space usually reserved for family photos or inspirational quotes. It's just a financial document, a colleague once remarked, clearly puzzled by its placement. I smiled, neither defensive nor evangelical. It's a reminder, I said simply. I never explain its significance fully. Some stories belong only to those who have lived them, their meaning clear only to those who have paid the full price of admission. The document speaks to me in a language others cannot hear, of promises kept, of boundaries maintained, of a self gradually uncovered rather than constructed. Late that evening, after my guests had gone and the house had settled back into its comfortable silence, I took a glass of wine onto my back patio. The night was clear, stars visible despite the city lights that usually obscured them. A slight breeze carried the scent of the roses I had planted along the fence, a climbing variety that had taken 3 seasons to fully establish but now bloomed with reliable abundance. The moon hung low and full, casting everything in silver light and deep shadow. I traced the constellations I had learned as a child, finding comfort in their ancient, indifferent patterns. I thought about the long path that had led me here, the lessons acquired through loss as well as gain. How boundaries, once established, become not walls but foundations. How peace, once discovered, becomes not an absence but a presence, something you actively cultivate rather than passively receive. How strength grows not from never being wounded, but from healing with intention and awareness. I thought about the woman I had become. Not perfect, not without regrets, but authentic in a way I couldn't have imagined in those earlier years of compliance and compromise. I sat with these thoughts without trying to resolve them into neat conclusions, allowing them to exist as part of the ongoing conversation I now maintain with myself. Honest, curious, occasionally challenging, but fundamentally kind. I don't know if my family understands even now what actually happened. Perhaps in their version of the story, I am still the villain, cold, ungenerous, placing property above blood ties. Perhaps they tell themselves that I will eventually relent, that time will soften my stance, that the natural order of family obligation will reassert itself. Perhaps they have constructed elaborate justifications for their actions, rewriting history to cast themselves as well-intentioned victims of my unreasonable rigidity. I imagine them discussing me at holiday gatherings I no longer attend, shaking their heads at my continued absence, reassuring each other that they had only been trying to help, that I had misunderstood their intentions, that my response had been disproportionate to their transgression. I wonder sometimes if they ever question their assumptions, if they ever consider the possibility that their definition of family, of love itself, might be fundamentally flawed. That connection without respect is not love, but control. That generosity without consent is not kindness, but appropriation. They don't understand that what happened wasn't a temporary break, but a permanent realignment. Not a door slammed in anger, but a quiet, deliberate step across a threshold into a different way of being. Into a life where respect isn't something you hope for, but something you require. Where love exists only where boundaries are honored. Where home isn't just a physical space, but the embodiment of a promise you keep to yourself. The stars turned slowly overhead as I sat in my garden, alone but not lonely. The distinction matters. Loneliness is the absence of connection. Aloneness, at its best, is the presence of self, undiluted, undistracted, uncompromised. I traced the rim of my wine glass with one finger, listening to the faint musical note it produced. A cricket began its evening song somewhere in the garden beds. Soon others joined it, a chorus of tiny musicians hidden in the darkness.
I had lost a family, yes.
But I had found something equally valuable, the courage to live on my own terms, to value my own story even when others sought to diminish it, to recognize that some sacrifices are not worth making, no matter how loudly tradition and expectation might argue otherwise, to understand that sometimes the most profound act of self-respect is the quiet, undramatic refusal to participate in your own erasure. I thought about the younger version of myself, the one who had signed mortgage papers with trembling hands, the one who had stayed up nights worrying about house payments, the one who had learned to fix broken pipes and patch drywall rather than admit she needed help. I wished I could reach back through time and tell her that she was building more than a house, that each payment, each repair, Each decision was a brick in the foundation of a self that would someday be strong enough to withstand even the betrayal of those she trusted most. I wondered what she would make of me now, this older, steadier version of herself. I hoped she would recognize the strength she had always possessed, even when she doubted it most deeply. I finished my wine as the moon rose higher, casting silver light across the garden I had created from nothing but time and attention. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and rewards. Client meetings. Perhaps dinner with friends. The ordinary rhythm of a life being lived deliberately, thoughtfully, one careful choice at a time. I found myself looking forward to this ordinary day with quiet anticipation, the satisfaction of meaningful work, the pleasure of chosen company, the freedom to arrange my hours according to my own internal compass rather than external expectations. My parents had taught me one valuable lesson, though not the one they intended, that family is not defined by blood alone, but by respect, by the recognition of each person's right to author their own story, by boundaries maintained not with anger, but with calm conviction. They know this now, whether they acknowledge it or not. And I am finally living on my own terms. The realization settled over me like a comfortable weight, neither triumphant nor bitter, simply true in a way that required no external validation. In the distance, a neighborhood dog barked once, twice, then fell silent. An owl called from the stand of pines at the end of my street. The night gathered around me, vast and intimate at once, a reminder of how small our human dramas are in the grand scheme of things, and yet how essential they feel while we're living them. Sometimes, in quiet moments like this, I try to imagine what might have been different if they had simply asked. If they had approached me with respect rather than assumption, with request rather than invasion. If they had acknowledged my ownership, my autonomy, my right to participate in decisions that affected my life so directly. I like to think I would have found a way to help that preserved everyone's dignity. Perhaps a temporary arrangement with clear boundaries and timelines. Perhaps financial assistance that supported their independence rather than undermining mine. Perhaps even a genuine conversation about family resources and responsibilities that acknowledged my contributions rather than took them for granted. But that alternative history grows fainter with each passing season, less relevant to the life I actually inhabit. The paths not taken blur and fade like dreams upon waking, leaving behind only the sharp clarity of the path I did choose. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small decisions to value myself as highly as I had been taught to value others. What matters is not what might have happened, but what did, and what I chose to do in response. How I refused to bend when bending would have broken something essential in me. How I learned that standing alone is far preferable to kneeling in company. How I discovered that true connection requires equality, respect, and the freedom to say no without fear of abandonment or retaliation. The night air has grown cooler now, nudging me toward the warmth of my home. The last sip of wine lingers on my tongue, rich and complex. I gather my empty glass, take one last look at the stars that have witnessed so much, and turn toward the house that remains, after everything, entirely mine. Not just legally, though the paperwork is clear. Not just financially, though every payment came from my own accounts. But fundamentally, spiritually mine in a way that transcends documentation or transaction. Mine because I claimed it, protected it, refused to surrender it even when surrender would have been easier than resistance. Mine because I recognized its value when others saw only its utility. Mine because I was willing to lose what was never really mine, conditional approval, situational inclusion, to keep what truly was, my sovereignty, my sanctuary, my self-respect. The choice seems obvious now, viewed through the clarifying lens of time and distance. But I remember how difficult it was in the moment, how alone I felt, how much I questioned myself in those first weeks of silence. Whether I was overreacting, being selfish, failing to understand some deeper family dynamic that would have made their actions reasonable rather than presumptuous. The pressure to compromise, to accommodate, to prioritize harmony over honesty had been instilled in me long before I had language to name it. Breaking free of that pattern had required a kind of courage I didn't know I possessed until I exercised it. I closed the door behind me, secure in the knowledge that only those I welcome will ever cross this threshold again. The familiar weight of the door, the solid sound of the lock engaging, these small sensations have become a ritual, a physical reminder of the boundaries I have learned to maintain in all areas of my life. This is what victory looks like, not trumpets and celebrations, but quiet evenings in rooms of your own making. Not the defeat of enemies, but the establishment of peace on terms you can live with honorably. Not the absence of loss, but the presence of something more valuable than what was lost. This is how healing happens, not all at once in dramatic reconciliation, but day by day in the steady accumulation of moments lived with integrity. This is how you build a life when the one you thought you had reveals itself to be constructed on sand, brick by brick, choice by choice, boundary by necessary boundary, until you find yourself standing on solid ground of your own creation. I move through my darkened living room, trailing my fingers along the back of the couch, remembering how empty this space felt when I first moved in. How each addition, the reading lamp found at an estate sale, the quilt made by a colleague's mother, the painting from a local artist, transformed it gradually from a house into my home. Not through expensive purchases or professional decorating, but through patient curation of objects that carried meaning beyond their function. A home built not for impression but for comfort, not for others' approval, but for my own contentment. Inside, my home welcomes me with the familiar scent of lemon and wood polish, with the soft texture of carpets I chose for their resilience rather than show. With the weight of books on shelves I built with my own hands. With a quiet that comes not from emptiness, but from carefully curated peace. I pause by the window, watching as a neighbor's cat prowls along the garden wall, its movements deliberate and unhurried. I think about the word home, how it has transformed for me over these years from a physical location to a state of being. A place where I am neither performing nor hiding, neither accommodating nor resisting. Simply existing, fully, and without apology.